Welcome to the Author Corner, our chance to meet the authors you'll want to read. I'm Stephanie, and I'm delighted to be joined by my literal favorite author in the world, my husband, Kieran Larkin, who is the author of the series about prophets of the Bible, Old Testament prophets, women prophets, and most recently, prophets of the New Testament. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's always nice to be here.
And literally, when people say to me, you interview a lot of authors, who's your favorite? You're my favorite.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that too. Yeah.
So you like the prophets, huh?
Well, yes. In a word, yes. As someone who's been a religion teacher my entire adult life, I've always looked on the prophets as being quite heroic. Starting with the prophets in the Old Testament, we're dealing with a bunch of men and women who were called upon God to deliver messages to the people. And while you might think that is a great honor, and I'm not saying that it's not, it really resulted for most of the prophets in a life of hardship, degradation, and in some cases even death. Being called by God to be a prophet was not a bed of roses. It meant that you were going to be delivering a lot of negative messages, recriminations, even threats from God to a group of people who just didn't want to hear it, weren't going to listen, or if they did listen, were going to ignore what you had to say, or just spit in your face and throw you out the door. So I've always considered these people to really, really be quite heroic.
Did you have, when you were 6 years old in the Lives of the Saints book, and you like Daniel? Is that why it started?
Not that I remember at the age of 6, which was a few years ago. Certainly, I'm sure in my youth, I thumbed through books of the saints. And I'm sure that there were several especially noteworthy or role models to be emulated. As far as Daniel is concerned, much to my chagrin, since Daniel is one of my all-time favorites, I've become aware of the fact that recent biblical scholarship is suggesting he may never have really existed.
Oh,
he
no.
may only have been
a fictional character?
A fictional character,
oh, that's
yes.
Awful.
And if that's true, and I sincerely hope it's not, that breaks my heart.
I get that.
I'm hoping all those pundits are wrong about that. Well, we'll find out.
Well, you had Old Testament prophets, you had women prophets, which, personally I like that book. And your most recent is New Testament prophets. Just asking, didn't the prophets tell us that Jesus was coming? And doesn't that mean that New Testament and prophet, I don't get it.
Well, I think what you're saying now tends to be a very popular misconception.
Okay.
Certainly, the word prophet just means messenger. Most people think that prophet means you're making predictions about the future. It's more about prognostication than delivery of messages. And that's the problem. I think we connect the word prophet, of course, with the word prophecy. Right. And the word prophecy implies to us prediction making. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, certainly, some of the prophets of the Old Testament did make predictions that God was going to send a Messiah, a Savior. Someone, of course, we believe was fulfilled by Jesus. But that's just one message. Okay. And it wasn't a message that was delivered by all the prophets. For the most part, many of the prophets were delivering the message that God is unhappy with the Israelites. He's unhappy that they entered into a covenant with him that was supposed to have been honored throughout the ages, but they were dropping the ball and not honoring the stipulations of that covenant. And prophets would wind up saying to the Israelites, God is upset with you. God feels as though you're not living out your end of the bargain. And if you recognize this and get your act together, everything will be fine. But if you don't, you're going to be punished and you're not going to like the results. And prophet after prophet after prophet delivered variations of that same message. And lo and behold, time after time after time, the words of the prophets went in one ear and out the other. And the result was a whole series of calamities befalling the Israelites that they attribute to the fact that they did not live up to their end of the covenant. So that probably is the hallmark of the prophetic message. But of course, towards the second half of the prophetic deliverances of messages, that was when the realization or the prophecy that God was going to send a Messiah began to emerge. Now, but moving ahead from that, the first book that I wrote, called Messengers of God, does not cover every prophet in the Old Testament. I mean, there are hundreds of them mentioned by name, and probably many more who were never mentioned by name. But as a teacher in an all-girls high school, when I presented this first book to my students, one of the students asked me, "Are there any women in the book?" And I thought that was quite the telling question. I've always prided myself on being something of a feminist, but I had to say to that student, no, there aren't women in this book. That's a great question you've asked. The fact of the matter is, probably because of a patriarchal attitude, or perhaps just blatant chauvinism throughout the Old Testament times, there were very few women who were mentioned as prophets, and even the women who are listed as prophets have scant information written about them. So that led to the second book, Women Prophets of the Old Testament. And I have to be honest, while I was very excited to write that book, it required a heck of a lot more research, simply because there's so much less information available.
Right.
But those two books, which still don't cover all the prophets of the Old Testament, at least hit some of the major ones, I think.
Right.
But then that brings us to the New Testament. And as you said earlier, a lot of people think that the whole point of the Old Testament prophets was to deliver the message that God is going to send a Messiah. And for those of us who are Christians who believe that happened in the form of Jesus, well, then you don't need any more prophets.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, this is not about predicting the future. This book on New Testament prophets is about the fact that God still does send messengers. But this book also places a great deal of emphasis on the fact that prophets can deliver messages in a wide variety of different ways, not just through delivering speeches or through writing out books or epistles or whatever you want to call them. They can deliver God's message through laws, through singing and dancing, through oracles, through visions, through dreams. There are so many different avenues that they can employ to deliver God's messages. So there are prophets in the Old Testament before the arrival of Jesus, during the time of Jesus, and even after Jesus' ministry has come to its conclusion. So I have to admit that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me, even though I expected as much before I started the book.
Well, now that you've exhausted the prophets, even though you said...
Yeah, I don't think that you can ever exhaust the prophets. But I think I've made headway.
Are there going to be more prophets books, or have you as an author said, I think that I am done writing in this genre, and now I'm going to move to something else?
Well, I think there will be additional books on the prophets. I'm just not the person who's going to write them.
Well, I think
that ship has sailed. I'm content with what I've done. I don't know if I'm ever going to feel an inclination to present new prophets, or by that I mean prophets I haven't previously discussed in these books. But who can predict the future?
You never know. I mean,
Exactly.
there are 3 books sitting here, and kind of like George Lucas with Star Wars. Yeah. I mean, there may be more.
Well, I've heard you mention on occasion that there are a lot of people out there who have writing a book as a part of their bucket list. And certainly, I'm sure that I'm one of the people who said way back when, gee, I wonder if I have it in me to write a book. And like most people, my answer was very clear. No, of course I don't. We're talking a couple of hundred pages. I'm lucky if I can write a couple of paragraphs. So I'm as surprised as anyone, A, that I actually completed the first book, much less that I have a second book and a third book to my credit. And much to my disbelief, I'm starting to work on a fourth book now. So
it's like potato chips. You
never
just can't
say never.
stop at one.
That's right. Never say never. That's what I'm discovering.
So that fourth book, I'm guessing, is not about the prophets.
It's not about the prophets, but it doesn't mean I've exhausted the roster of religious characters or religious personalities from the Bible. No, actually, I've started working on a book that has proven to be much more difficult than I ever thought it would be, on St. Joseph, the foster father of Jesus. I figured someone as prominent as St. Joseph would be so easy to write about. And it goes to show you what happens when you walk into a situation assuming a certain thing, only to find out that assumption was way off base. You know what they say about assume?
Yes.
Leave it at that.
Well, I think in life, don't we sometimes think the easy thing and it turns out to be the hard thing?
Well, certainly that's very, very true in this case. I was anticipating little to no difficulty with the book. And the reason I say that is there are novelists out there who have a storyline in their head, and somehow or other they manage to flesh it out. And maybe they've plotted it out in advance. Maybe they're just kind of writing it as they go. I find that for myself, I don't think I had that level of creativity. I think for me, I like the idea of writing about something where I know the information is out there, just waiting to be, gleaned, sifted through, and put on paper. With St. Joseph, I figured he's one of the most prominent figures in Christianity. There's got to be lots of material out there, and there is, except a lot of it is inaccurate, or it's exaggerated, or it's hyperbole of some kind or other, or just fictional. And trying to get out and figure out exactly where truth begins and fiction ends is not really easy at all. And the fact that St. Joseph did not utter a single word recorded in the Bible doesn't make it any easier to try to get into his head, so to speak, and figure out what's making him tick. So it's been much, much more of a problem than I thought it would be.
Well, I mean, not for nothing. I'm sure lots of these people that you wrote about also never uttered a word in the Bible.
Well, we do have books of the Old Testament that are the written down words of many of the prophets.
Okay.
And there are other prophets for whom written words by their own pen are not forthcoming, but whose basic philosophy we can present in our own words. Unfortunately, there were no tape recorders in those days or anything like that. It's a fair thing to say that we do lack a great deal of biographical information on most of the prophets. And in some cases, what we piece together, if we're trying to flesh out a biography for them, is based more on, I don't want to say hearsay or innuendo, but just on reflective fiction, I guess. Gee, this sounds like he might have done this, so let's say that he did. No one is in a position to contradict us.
Right. It happened thousands of years ago.
And the fact of the matter is, in writing a book about St. Why am I pointing there? The book's not there. In writing a book about St. Joseph.
Yes.
Yes, maybe there's one, we'll go on the top of that pile. But in writing a book about him, there is just very, very little to go on. And I know what I was going to say. There are stories about him written by authors around the time of Christ whose written words were not included in the New Testament, who offer stories about St. Joseph that are just unbelievably far-fetched. Innovative, yes, but accurate, not in the slightest. And unfortunately, too many people read these words, modern day accounts of what was written generations ago, and take them at face value as truthful. So you wind up having to sort through what is a great deal of fictional writing and try to discover if there is actually a gleam of truth anywhere to be found.
Well, I can't imagine doing that for something that happened 2,000 years ago, because we seem to have that problem just today, knowing what is truth.
Exactly.
So I'm sure 2,000 years ago, what is truth is even more nebulous. Let me ask you about these prophets and even about St. Joseph. I'm guessing that you wrote these and that you were drawn to them, not just because they were interesting people in the past, but also because of the lessons for today.
Well, yes. I think in a word, yes. I think I've always found a certain appeal in the lives of the prophets, and I've always held them in very, very high regard. And I was actually teaching a course on the Old Testament prophets before I even started writing these books. And when I chose to begin writing, my thought process went something like this. I already have a great deal of material about each of these prophets in the form of notes that I use in conducting class. Those notes in and of themselves would not constitute an entire book.
Right.
But if I use them as a starting point and continue to do additional research, hopefully I can flesh out more information to generate into a work that is entirely a book in format or in length.
Right.
So that's what's happened there.
Was there anything you discovered in this that shocked you? Like, did you think, like you mentioned, how Daniel may not be actually true, but was there somebody that you thought, I know about this person, and then you found out you were like, whoa, I didn't know that?
Probably yes to all of them. Kids growing up, even if kids are going to a religious affiliated school, a Christian school, might learn something of the Bible that's incredibly rudimentary. And probably most kids, myself included, recognize the prophets by name without necessarily knowing that much about them personally. So when I started working on a course on the prophets, I had to go out and dig a lot deeper. And then I had to dig even deeper than that in writing these books. To get back to your question, I think, yes, I think I did have some sort of an interest in the prophets going in, but just on a very, very superficial level.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's where too many of our students, even in religious affiliated schools, stand today. The prophets are names that they recognize, about whom the students can offer no details.
Right. Now, are there any prophets, I mean, we live in a kind of chaotic world, that we should be looking at today? You know, whether on a global level or even on a personal level. Do you have a personal favorite that guides you in your life, or one that you'd recommend?
There are a couple of them who stand out, and not necessarily for good reasons.
Okay.
Now, as I said to you before, Daniel has always been one of my favorites. And the thought that maybe he was just a fictional character is, I find, very, very disquieting. But in Daniel's case, he was a young man who was kidnapped by the Babylonians and brought up to be a Babylonian. The Babylonians were trying to get him to reject his previously held religious beliefs. They bombarded him with information about the Babylonian culture. They tried to teach him the Babylonian language. They gave him a Babylonian name, but he never varied from his faith in God. And he became such an important person politically as well as spiritually in the Babylonian nation that when Babylon fell to the Persians, his reputation was so sterling, he maintained a very, very high position in the administration of the Persian conquerors of Babylon. So he's always stood out, not just because of his deep faith, but just because of his stature and somehow merging and excelling both in matters theological and political. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there's the prophet Jonah. Now, we all know the story of the prophet Jonah being swallowed by the great whale and so on and so forth. Jonah, we know, is a fictional character. Oh. I hope Daniel isn't, but we know that Jonah is. Oh. But what I find incredibly interesting about Jonah is that rather than be the prophet, which he was, you could even build a strong case for calling him the anti-prophet. In the story of Jonah, God calls Jonah to deliver a message to the Assyrians, a tribe that was an enemy of the Israelites. And Jonah could not believe that God was calling upon him to deliver a message to his enemies. So he says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going. And instead of heading east from where he lived to Assyria, he said, I'm heading in the opposite direction. And he hopped on a boat to carry him, from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean all the way to the western shores in Spain. Never got there. We all know the story of there being
by a whale.
Yes, we know the story of there being a major storm at sea, and Jonah admitting to the people on the boat with him that probably this is unnatural. This is probably God's way of showing Jonah how upset he is, and Jonah telling the captain of the ship, you really should throw me overboard to save yourselves. And grudgingly, they do. They throw him overboard. The winds die down. Everything is fine. He's swallowed by a whale and eventually spit up on the shore 3 days later. And finally, given a second chance by God, he goes out and does what God asked him to do. But he's still unhappy that God is sending a message to the enemies of Israel that he's willing to forgive them for their transgressions. And he's hoping against hope that the people don't listen to him and continue on their nefarious ways so that God can smite them all down. So it's so bizarre to see us acknowledge a man whose ministry consisted of rejecting God, doing the opposite of what God wanted him to do, finally changing his mind, doing what God wants, and still being unsatisfied with that and hoping it's not going to work out. It's just such a very strange story, not just in its own nature, but the fact that it was recorded in our Old Testament.
Yeah, it's like a weird anti-hero.
You would not think that would be a person who would be featured.
Right.
Now, you asked me the question earlier, is there any one person that I knew nothing about that I became very, very taken with? And the answer to that is actually found in the book on women's prophets. There was a prophetess named Huldah. And Huldah, we believe, was actually related to the prophet Jeremiah. Okay. And at the time that Huldah lived and Jeremiah lived, Israel was going through some rough times. A series of Israelite kings had not only violated the covenant, but were actually worshiping other false gods and goddesses. And different prophets were telling them they've got to turn it around. One of these kings, who was actually a very, very good king and who tried to do the right thing, unearthed some documents that had been concealed in the Temple of Jerusalem and unearthed during its renovation that suggested that God was very, very unhappy with the Israelites and that God was going to punish them. And when this king realized that, and his name was King Josiah, when he read this information and realized that they were in deep trouble, he initiated a very, very strong series of reforms to fly right. But he wanted to verify that this was indeed the word of God that had been discovered. And apparently, Jeremiah, who lived at that time, was not available. So he turned to a woman prophet, or prophetess, believed to have been related to Jeremiah, and asked her to look at this document. Now, we really have almost zero information about Huldah. We believe that she was simply a seamstress. Her husband, we believe, was in charge of the king of Judea's wardrobe, and that she worked with her husband as a seamstress Maybe she ran a school for women. Maybe she was a librarian, but the jury seems to be out. But she's the one who verified this work as being authentic. But that's only the beginning of her story. It turns out with more recent biblical scholarship that this woman may have been a heck of a lot more than a seamstress who was doubling as a prophet. Other more recent research suggests she may have remarried. We don't know if she was a widow or if her husband divorced her or what, but went on to become the queen of Judea, the mother of who would be Judea's next king, and in her own right was incredibly powerful, but also may have had a hand in the writing of perhaps 20 to 25 different books of the Old Testament.
Wow.
And all of this is coming out now through some intense, virtually AI analysis into sacred scripture. So the jury is out on her. What is being unearthed now by computer usage of the Old Testament, is it accurate? Is it not accurate? I don't know. But if it is accurate, she may turn out to be the single most important woman in the entire Old Testament.
Wow.
Possibly.
That is definitely something to unearth.
It is. One author has already written a book on her. She's mentioned in like 2 or 3 lines twice in the Old Testament,
Right.
with the same information recorded both times. The fact that another author has written an entire book about this woman based on the research he's done via computer begs the question, can we use computers in the future to unearth more information about other prophets? Is this information accurate? Does it or should it change our view not only of her, but of the role that women played throughout the Old Testament? Could there have been a lot more women prophets in the Old Testament that have been just buried by a patriarchal society? It just raises a lot of interesting issues.
All right. Well, prophets of the New Testament, but it sounds like there's a whole lot of women prophets we want to read about also, as well as prophets of the Old Testament. Kieran, thanks for joining us. And for all of us, thanks for informing us. Thanks for joining us.
We're just books up on a shelf. Try to understand this if you can.